So, you want to know the history of adoption and foster care. You think it's fluffy stuffed animals and puppies waving in the wind? Incorrect. We're going to go through the history of industrialized adoption in a global perspective. 안녕하세요. 김윤미입니다. 파작! 메롱. The first thing I should address is that my particular city I'm stuck in currently won't let me film if I do it for profit, and then I'd have to pay them a ton of money I don't have. Unfortunately, books cost money, and I need to make a bit of profit in order to do this labor-intensive work. If you do want me to appear live to camera instead of as a cartoon character, you can donate to my Ko-Fi, subscribe, like, and comment. Secondly, you are free to doubt me. I encourage thoughtful discussions, but as I've provided my sources, if you doubt me, I expect you to also have reliable sources on your end as well. Your opinion off the top of your head isn't good enough. Please give some semblance on where you got your opinions and ideas from. I'll provide my sources for free. Lastly, for those who have triggers, this has all of the major triggers attached. That given, I'm going to try my best to not portray super violent acts because I'm not about glorifying violence, but trying to be honest that it existed. However, there might be some content that I can't put up on YouTube. I will include cute animals in between the really difficult bits, not to trivialize, but because I believe everyone needs a break once in a while. That given, I should introduce myself. 안녕하세요. I am Yunmi Kim. I have a degree in anthropology from a university I often ridicule, so I don't want to be sued by revealing it, even if all the statements I say about it are true for the time I was there. I concentrated my BA in systems, which include racism, sexism, poverty, adoption, etc. I am an adoptee, and I've been quietly active in the adoption community for years, doing minor activism along the way. The triggers for this episode include, but are not limited to, institutionalized adoption violence, colonialism, imperialism, racialized violence and subjugation, religious abuse, and general genocide. All the mental health to you. Take breaks as you need and manage your spoons well. This one is going to slap you in the face. The first case was Greece's city-states and later Rome. Children were sometimes abandoned on the outskirts of the city, such as Rome, Athens, Sparta, etc., to die. Mothers usually abandoned them because they were disabled or they simply couldn't take care of them. In cases where the child was healthy, sometimes people would go to that special place to find a child and turn them into a slave. If they were a slave, they had an opportunity to buy themselves out of slavery, but most records show this was not common. This is evidenced by this source about ancient Greece, which says, when a child was born, it was not regarded as a person until it was 5 days old, when a special ceremony was held and the child became part of the family. Parents were entitled, by law, to abandon newborn babies to die of exposure. Sometimes strangers would adopt abandoned babies. However, in that case, the baby became a slave. Life in Ancient Greece by Tim Lambert. Sometimes children were adopted into the family to preserve the family line, but those were not those abandoned babies, but rather an older child family member, such as a nephew. In addition, the fathers were allowed to reject the children in Athens. In Athens, children were looked at as heirs of the estate, thus they were really important to the family. The newly born was not always accepted, contrary to the Homeric times, as it was not a crime. The father decided if he would accept the child or abandon them, leaving them in front of a temple. Boys were more useful to the families, and therefore it was more often for the rejected children to be girls rather than boys. Children and Childhood in Ancient Greece by M. Metodieva. In Sparta, the father took the child to the elders who inspected it. If the child was disabled, the child might be killed. According to History.com, all Spartan infants were brought before a council of inspectors and examined for physical defects, and those who weren't up to standards were left to die. The ancient historian Plutarch claimed these ill-born Spartan babies were tossed into a chasm at the foot of Mount Taygetus, but most historians now dismiss this as a myth. If a Spartan baby was judged to be unfit for its future duty as a soldier, it was most likely abandoned on a nearby hillside. Left alone, the child would either die of exposure or be rescued and adopted by strangers. 8 Reasons It Wasn't Easy Being Spartan by Evan Andrews. There is a Science.org article which counters the idea that infanticide was common. Sneed says archaeological evidence supports that view, showing babies with profound health problems at birth were cared for well beyond their first weeks of life. In 1931, for example, excavators uncovered the remains of more than 400 infants in a well in Athens. In a 2018 analysis, archaeologists showed the remains were mostly just a few days old at most, consistent with typical patterns of high infant mortality in the ancient world, not selective infanticide. However, the same article pointed out, could you define all of ancient Greek and Roman society as getting rid of weak babies? Absolutely not, says Christian Lays, a classicist at the University of Manchester. But absence of evidence does not mean the phenomenon itself was absent. He argues that based on ethnographic examples from other societies, babies were abandoned or killed regularly if families couldn't afford to raise them. Societal discomfort or shame, he suggests, might help explain why a common practice might not be mentioned in more ancient sources. Ancient Greeks didn't kill weak babies, new study argues. Stories of Sparta aside, analysis questions the idea that infirm infants were abandoned to die. By Andrew Curry. Using my anthropology degree for something here, but I have to interject to point out that if the infant was taken to a place to die of exposure, it's unlikely there would be many remains left. There are wild animals and such, and it might be grim to say, but baby bones are fragile and soft. So bones, etc., are not likely to survive in the case of edge of city exposure. But let's continue on. Aristotle, of course, blamed women for birth defects because he's not some hard-working woman hater, and said it was how the child was gestated that caused them disabilities. Don't worry, he'll come back later in the series when we talk about how Aristotle isn't Jesus despite what Thomas Aquinas wanted. Do you want to talk about ensoulment and how women get their souls later than men? Don't worry, Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas is here for you. I suppose around here some people saw the timestamp and they are listening to this as a podcast, even though I've added some animations and I worked really hard for accuracy, but good luck doing your dishes. Anyway, some people also think the belief system of Changeling was similar in flavor. For those that don't know, according to Britannica.com, Changeling in European folklore, a deformed or intellectually disabled offspring of fairies or elves substituted by them surreptitiously for a human infant. Changeling folklore, Britannica.com. The major locale and origin for this is said to be pre-industrial Europe, but mainly attributed to the Celts, particularly Ireland and Scotland. The autism community in particular tends to connect changelings with autism, neurodivergence, and the disability community. Kaylee Whalen states, one of my primary interests in changeling folklore is how it may be tied to historical attempts to explain developmental disabilities and intellectual disabilities in children, including autism, ADHD, epilepsy, dyslexia, hyperlexia, dyscalculia, and Down syndrome. Changelings and the Folk History of Autism by Kaylee Whalen. The idea is if you starved a changeling or left them in that special place, the true baby would be returned to the parents. But what about outside of Scotland and Ireland and other cases of child demons? Well...
Warning! Rabbit hole! Warning! Rabbit hole!
Trigger warning. This section deals with child loss, pregnancy loss, and pregnant person death. So rabbit holes are slightly off-topic research I did for the video that are tangentially related and where I don't have to do so much heavy animation. For this one, I thought I would cover other locales similar to the changeling myth and other fetus, infant, child demons and demons related to childbirth in general. Other locales for similar to the changeling myth are Germany, Wales, Poland, Sweden, connected to the trolls, Norway, Denmark, Faroe Islands, and Iceland. D.L. Ashleyman. According to Historic Mysteries, in Germany, the changeling is referred to as Wechselkind, Wechselbad, Dietkopf, or Kehlkopf. Possible parents of such a changeling were considered to be a female dwarf, the devil, a water spirit, or a Ragamume, a fire demon of the corn. In early Welsh folklore, changeling children had a lot of resemblance to the human children for which they were exchanged. But later Welsh tales are very different. Their appearance becomes uglier, and their behavior is characterized as malformed, ill-featured, ill-tempered, and they even turn to biting and screaming. In Poland folklore, Boginki or Manuna is known to be a Slavic spirit that keeps exchanging human babies in the cradle. The changelings that Mamuna planted in the place of the human child are known for their distinct appearance. With unusually long or small head, excessively large abdomen, thin legs and arms, a hump, long claws, and a hairy body. The changeling's first teeth would also appear earlier in comparison to normal human children. Your Child is Not Your Own, The Horrific Tales of Medieval Changelings by Bipin Dimri. Some people also think it was a way to cope with the high child mortality rate in pre-industrial Europe, but the myth persisted well into the 19th century and was later transferred to women, such as with the case of Bridget Cleary. Michael Cleary claimed that his wife was transformed into a changeling in 1895. She contracted bronchitis, was diagnosed, and then he killed her. He was still sentenced to manslaughter. After the 19th century, the rate of infant mortality fell and belief in changelings went with it as the rise of medical science became more prevalent. Hand washing in medicine became common practice in Europe, particularly championed by Ignace Semmelweis, who advocated for the washing of hands before childbirth in 1847. He was not the first to advocate for cleanliness when it came to medicine. Moses ben Maimon, also known as Maimonides, 1138 CE to 1204 CE, recognized the need in 1199 CE, and later championed by Florence Nightingale during the Crimean War, October 5th, 1853 to March 30th, 1856. Once a clean operating field through antiseptic surgery was advocated for by Joseph Lister in 1867, the childbed fever started to fall in Europe. The fall in infant mortality might have ended the need for the belief in changelings. As for other child demons worldwide, Porgniets from Slavic mythology is about stillborns. If you didn't bury the stillborn infant properly, then it would come back as a vengeful ghost. According to the Wikipedia page about them, which has a reference to
Religia Słowian,
by
Andrzej Szyjewski.
Women get blamed again because one is created by drawing water from a well, leaving home with an infant, or engaging in sexual intercourse while pregnant. This story is more of an explanation of how the stillborn came to be. But the fact that it turns demonic and haunts the parents seems like a reminder to treat the dead with respect, even if it's a stillborn baby. Mailingar from Scandinavian folklore are children that were unwanted by their mothers and roamed the earth looking for someone to bury them properly. The next tale is the Chanak from Philippine mythology. In this mythology, the woman has died in childbirth, so she and her baby would be heard lamenting at night. They lead the travelers astray. The justification is that the unborn or newly born child is now born in the ground, according to Mandaya people. The Pontianak is similar from Malay culture. Sui, demon, is from China. This is the justification for why children get money. It's originally to keep this demon that would make them howl in terror, speak nonsense, and keep the child from going, quote, insane, unquote, or, quote, stupid, unquote. This is the most similar to the changeling tale, but it has a happier ending because the parents fend off the demon by giving their children money. Thus, it too is a reminder to parents to treat their children well. From Japanese mythology, there is a konaki chichi, which has the appearance of a man or a baby. Then it turns into a stone and kills the victim. But unlike the tale of the changeling, this serves as a reminder to not abandon your children, because it's often thought to be made from a baby left to die out in the wilderness. Also from Japanese myth are the stories of Ubume and Mizuko, which are similar. Ubume is the spirit of a woman who died in childbirth, but also women that died during postpartum and do not get to hold their children. This serves as a reminder to let the mother hold their child right away. Mizuko are miscarried or aborted fetuses that come to haunt their mothers. It's a way to reconcile the grief from the loss, and there are special ceremonies held for the spirit. What I think these stories go to show, besides the ones that blame women for things like miscarriage, is that the loss of children is really difficult to handle as a parent, and doubly difficult when it is a parent who wanted the child with all their heart, and then they had to witness the loss of their lover and child. The unsettled feelings from that live on in the memory of the family and their community, which is often why these stories end with a reminder to treat and treasure your children, either spiritually or literally. So maybe this isn't a complete rabbit hole?
End of rabbit hole. You may relax now. We return you to your regularly scheduled program.
So, before industrialization worldwide, though the visuals are using Tudor England, in agricultural societies, generally rather than only your nuclear family, meaning only the parents and kids living together, usually you lived with your extended family. This means sometimes one would live with their grandparents, old maid aunts, unmarried aunts, widowed aunts, and occasionally aunts and uncles. A village, or a group of villages, would be made up of your extended family members and people you've known all of your life, so everyone knew everyone else. The eldest son was likely to take care of his parents while taking over the family business, and thus was required to live with his father and mother. Sometimes, too, in Europe, the youngest son, who wouldn't be able to inherit anything and didn't want to become a member of the clergy, might move in with his wife instead of his parents because her family might be a family of only daughters. In other places, matrilocal, meaning the husband moved in with the wife's family, was the de facto way to marry. In either case, your paternal and maternal relatives were usually not that far from you. Nearby villages might have other aunts, uncles, and cousins. This meant a safety net for the parents if their child had difficulty. Since people didn't move that far from their hometowns and were mostly sedentary, Sedentary meaning they lived in the same spot year-round and made permanent settlements and didn't move throughout their lifetime that often. Children were cared for by neighbors or villagers as well as their families. It might lead to feuds as people couldn't move away, but at the same time, it meant children had others to care and think about them. The only exception to this was merchants and actors. For example, Christopher Marlowe and William Shakespeare were well known to be cousins, and they knew it too. Canterbury, England is Christopher Marlowe's assumed place of birth. Stratford-upon-Avon is about 6 days by horse and carriage, but there is ability to transport letters and such, but you'd kind of hope that it got to its destination in this time period until about 1780 for this region. Today, it takes about 3 hours and 15 minutes by car. Considering things, that's not that far, and sending a child that distance was much better than the child being destitute. This meant the family bonds in this time period were generally much stronger because you knew your family and usually cared about them. If you had rich relatives, you were likely to be sent there to be cared for, though this wasn't always ideal. If you were poor, you might be adopted by a local villager who would take you in as an apprentice for their shop. For example, the Poor Relief Act of 1601 stated that the impotent poor, people who can't work, were to be cared for in an almshouse or a poorhouse. The law offered relief to people who were unable to work, mainly those who were lame, impotent, old, blind. The able-bodied poor were set to work in a house of industry. Materials were to be provided for the poor to be set to work. Idle poor and vagrants were to be sent to a house of correction or even prison. Pauper children would become apprentices. Reginae Elizabethae, Anno 43, Chapter 2. In the case of Europe, if you persisted in being an apprentice, you might be lucky enough to become a journeyman. In Japan, too, sometimes you might become an apprentice and then, if you were really lucky, marry into the master's family instead of having to set up your own shop. This wasn't quite adoption, but maybe closer to what we think of as fostering. This system of apprenticing was in locations outside of England and Europe in general, found in mostly agricultural societies before the push for global industrialization and mass colonization. Under industrialization, both the system of apprenticing and villages caring for children has mostly died out. This is because the majority of industrial society today is neolocal and thus not sedentary and not patrilocal or matrilocal, according to Britannica.com. If newlyweds establish a home independent of the location of either set of parents, they are said to establish a neolocal residence. This has the upside of no witch belief. Because of neolocal living patterns too, orphan children or children removed from their homes don't always have physically close relatives to take care of them, but we'll touch upon this in a later episode. Interfamily adoption didn't only happen in Europe. Miyamoto Iori was cared for by his uncle. He was adopted by Miyamoto Musashi. He got to learn the family trade of being a master swordsman. If you were really unlucky, say a refugee, or you got severed from your community for whatever reason, say a flood or another disaster, sometimes the children would end up as beggars and live on the edge of towns. We'll touch on this more later, but for Europe, often the care for true orphans fell on the church. Similarly, for China and East Asia, orphans were cared for by Buddhist temples. So for Japan, for example, according to Toyotomi Hideyoshi, famous samurai was raised in a Buddhist temple in the Sengoku era, 1467 CE to 1615 CE. For indigenous communities, North, Central, and South America, often religious leaders would also take care of orphans, and sometimes other families would adopt them into their own families. From what I can find, this is true for the South Pacific, Africa, other parts of Asia such as Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Central Asia as well. Similar systems to the old medieval system or the religious leader adoption system were in place pre-colonization and pre-imperialization. In all of these cases, the children were able to maintain their identities and stay in their communities and/or with family members. But without state regulation, there might also be no oversight on where the children ended up, and their situation might not always be for the best. However, their identities would not be in doubt. If you're hoping for government intervention, it begins in 1885 in Britain. Other locations aren't much better. I'll cover how and why these agencies came to be in a later video. Then there is the third and last case for early adoption before industrialization, where children were taken to another state or country to set up an alliance. This was common in China, Japan, a bit in Korea, and sometimes in Europe between lords. For example, in Korea, to legitimize Prince Gwanghae, Queen Wien, who was queen to Seongjo, adopted him, but Prince Gwanghae's birth mother was royal noble consort Gong of the Kim clan. This system also worked to legitimize King Seongjo, King Choljong, and King Gojong. Sometimes the queen did it voluntarily after the king's death, but I still imagine one of the conversations might go something like the king saying, "Hey, Queenie, you know how you haven't given birth to a child that can inherit the throne? Well, I have a child I fathered from one of my concubines. Previous queens from another family member. You can legitimize. You'll adopt him so there isn't a war later, right? Right?" And the queen would say, "Sure, whatever." For Japanese samurai class, adoption allowed for social mobility. The common use of adoption in Japanese society has occasioned comment from several generations of Western observers. To some, it has appeared an unusual custom which deserved mention but not study. To others, it has seemed important for a variety of reasons: a means of preserving the family line, of finding a home for junior sons, of maintaining the religious functions of the family, of moving talent into positions of political responsibility. It is surprising how often the practice is mentioned in the literature on Tokugawa Japan, and how often it is seen as a channel of upward social mobility in a society which rested on hereditary status. Adoption and Samurai Mobility in Tokugawa Japan by Ray A. Moore. Also from Japan, a mukoyoshi, literally adopted son-in-law, is an adult man who is adopted into a Japanese family as a daughter's husband and who takes the family's surname. This is often when there are only women born into the family. This practice still goes on today. There is a similar practice in China called Ru Zhui in Mandarin and Yap Zhui in Cantonese. Disclaimer: I sincerely apologize for all of my Chinese pronunciations. I did try my best. This is where prestigious families might have the husband take the wife's name, not the reverse. This custom still happens in contemporary China today, but only in rural regions. Occasionally in Europe, they would send children to be raised in other countries. This was the case with Anne Boleyn, who was mainly raised in France. She was placed in a finishing school with Margaret of Austria and became a lady-in-waiting to Queen of France, Mary Tudor. Psst, not that one. The other one. Her sister was named Mary. The queen that she worked for was named Mary. And her stepchild was named Mary. Must have been hell at family reunions. This practice was to cement alliances between countries and sometimes as a suggestion of a marriage alliance later on. This wasn't always called adoption, but it was often like this de facto. And the third reason for adoption, children and people in general might be given opportunities of power or social economics they might not have otherwise, but total severance from their family wasn't part of the equation. They knew their family, who they belonged to, and conversed with them. The only advantage of the adoption was for these lords to gain social ground. So Anne Boleyn, learning French, oui, oui, bonjour, would help her in King Henry VIII's court, and she might learn politics, not my thing, or je regarde l'art français et la mode parisienne. Aussi, j'aime regarder au tennis. However, this is not what the series is going to talk about, but the majority of the series is going to talk about
the start of institutionalized and industrialized adoption.
Yes, if the truths were unpleasant in this episode, it's much worse next episode. I want to add a note. You might think I neglected the whole continent of Africa for bits of this episode, as well as Central South America and Australia/the Pacific. Due to large bits of colonization, the people who would have the information is encoded in oral traditions and word of mouth rather than written down. I didn't illustrate these regions for this particular episode since there are no concrete records from non-colonizers. If you are sad at the lack of representation and illustration of these specific places, it's not for the lack of my effort, but because colonizers and imperialism destroyed them or literally killed the people who would have possessed them. Source: Rupert Everett on Who Do You Think You Are? For me, it was like trying to wring out a dry washcloth, and often looking up these sorts of things regarding childcare pre-colonization gave me only ads about, oh, save the children, which I can only stomach for so long. So I'd appreciate your patience. We'll get there. Believe me, it's on my radar. Through this series on adoption, I hope people won't cherry pick the parts they only want to hear in order to support their preconceived notions of adoption, but rather listen to the positives and negatives throughout this series and really think about what one could do with the current challenges to improve social services for children in general. How do we combat the social inequality that is inherent in the system without taking advantage of people who have less? One can't make social change to a broken or otherwise rickety system if one doesn't look to the past on what has and hasn't worked. In this episode, one might think this period was ideal in some ways, because one wasn't cut off from one's identity, but often with the case of wardships, this wasn't a utopia. Catherine Parr's husband, Thomas Seymour, is well known for abusing Elizabeth I. Other lords tried to force their ward to stay in the family through forced marriages in order to keep the ward's riches. There was also no state regulation on things like the care of children beyond "don't murder them." So this time period was a mixed bag. On one hand, people could entirely take advantage of children in horrific ways and get no punishment, such as the case with Catherine Howard, and the victim would be blamed. Catherine Howard was raised by her step-grandmother and also abused. At one point, she was promised to her wrist. So, you knew who your relatives were, your identity, and your heritage. But on the other hand, you knew when your relatives were a piece of crap, when they mistreated you, and you might be carted off to various relatives with no oversight. Child abuse and spousal abuse was very common in Tudor England, at least, so welfare of children was in the forefront of law in this time period. One might buy the notion that industrialization was automatic, but this source says, on the contrary, it is now generally accepted that there was, in fact, a distinct view of childhood in the Middle Ages, that children were treated as children and not as adults, and that a good deal of attention and affection was bestowed upon them. Similarly, and not for the first time, but from an unexpected quarter, the popular contention that medieval history ended in the 1500s with the birth of the modern has been impugned, and Cleo saved from seduction by the false promises of French theorists. Children of the Middle Ages by Everett U. Crosby. As a review of Medieval Children by Nicholas Orme, Yale University Press. Issue Autumn 2002. The article goes on to point out that it was a mixed bag. It wasn't always good, but it wasn't always bad. However, the trust in the family as being able to take care of children was also strong around the world in this time period, no matter where you were. In all three cases, adoption wasn't governed by the state and wasn't truly formal. There was no paperwork, but along with it, also no formalized responsibility towards children. At the same time, children were given some semblance of their origins and where they came from. They had connection to either community or family or both. For vassals of the state, adoption was merely a means to an end, rather than finding substitute parents. It allowed social mobility and to be connected to higher stations. In this, there was a degree of consent between the so-called adoptee and their family of origin and an agreement with the target family who either temporarily or permanently took care of the children or adult in question. So join me next time when we look at the start of orphanages and other child laws that fed into the psychology about adoption. Before you go, if you hit the like button on this video and leave a comment, the algorithm will likely show it to those, but adoption is always good, and isn't it exciting to watch adopted child for a family YouTube exploitation? Watchers, since it's an early video, I get exactly $0 off of this. If you'd like my sources, they are in the transcript in the description box below, if I couldn't fit them specifically on the video. Expenses for this episode include, all in United States dollars, $24.08 for a microphone arm to make the audio sound more consistent, $6.56 for Children in English Society from Tudor Times to the 18th Century, Volume 1. Study in Social History, $59.99 per month times 9 months for the Adobe Suite. I'd also like more RAM for my 40 gigabyte iMac 2019 computer so that compiling and making episodes doesn't take so long. For 64 gigabytes of RAM, it is $154.99 without tax. For 128 gigabytes of RAM, it is $318.99. Credits: the writing, the drawing, the sound and production, and everything I did on my own, down to the brushes and all the assets, except where the credit was given to Narrate and the Rabbit Hole voice, which I got from Speechify. Neither are sponsors, and the vectored maps from Wikipedia Commons, which I made into globes with a lot of modifications, and any other credit given within the video. So if you would like to support me, please donate just a little money to my Ko-Fi to make up for my expenses. Thank you. Bye-bye. See you next time.